Hi guys, let's jump into the second video here where we're going to look at some changes when it comes to the global energy scene. And I thought I would start with a link. And if you want to find this link, you can look at the URL and type it into your browser and come here too. But it's looking at electricity. And so we'll talk more about electricity at the end of this particular video. But what you see is how much of the world is powered by electricity. And there are three main sources that we're looking at, which makes sense based on our studies of the energy flow diagrams. One is fossil fuels, another is nuclear, and another is renewables. So interestingly, if we turn off all of our sources, then we don't see anything lit up. Very few people probably use wood to actually power their area. So let's see what happens when we turn on fossil fuels. Let's see how much of the world lights up. Look, there's quite a bit. So what you see is most of the US, a lot of Europe, you see India down here, you see China, and some areas in the Middle East, well, most areas in the Middle East, and that would make sense, a lot of Italy and so forth. Okay, well, let's turn that off and let's look at how much of the world is powered by nuclear. So if we turn on the nuclear button, you see France is a big place here. France gets most of its energy, its electricity, I should say, from nuclear. You also see some with South Korea, and what you see here is just a note about Japan that we could look at later. And then also a good degree of the US is lit up by nuclear. But what you know from our previous studies is nuclear is not the main source of electricity in the United States. Okay, so there's some other small areas that are lit up that don't rely primarily on nuclear, but you can see them in that particular graphic. So now we're looking only at renewables, and this is really insightful. If you look at this graph, what you'll see is there are regions of Canada that use a lot of renewables. You'll see a lot of the EU uses renewables. You see Iceland up here and a lot of these sort of Scandinavian countries. And then you see a lot of India, which is interesting, China, and some South America. But this part is growing. So what you and I know is that in about 10 years, when we come back to this map and we switch on renewables, we'll see a lot more lit up. Probably when we switch on nuclear, we'll see a lot more lit up. And probably when we switch on fossil fuels, we would see a lot less. So that's kind of the shift that will hopefully be happening over time. So just thinking about what powers the world currently and how that will shift over time is actually really exciting. Now, I just wanted to look at this projection of energy use in the future. And what you and I know is that the population is growing, and hopefully it won't grow in an unbounded way. And hopefully there won't be a catastrophe that will lead to a decline. We all hope that no one suffers from anything like that. But, just based on general trends, we do believe that the population will rise over time. And as the population rises, energy demands will also rise. So the amount of energy that we use right now seems preposterously high, and it's going to get higher. So we have to prepare for that by being as thoughtful and efficient as we can with our energy use. All right, so most of the energy use, and you already know this from the readings, will come from China at first. India will catch up, and a little bit later, there will be a large rise in Africa as well. But if we just look to 2050, the main increases will come from China and from India. So this is in terms of energy use. The United States will stay kind of stable, in Europe also, and that's because most likely that population won't grow very much over that time for us. We're actually going to enter some kind of decline. Now, here's an interesting thing. And what I mean by decline is fewer children per couple will be produced for a while. So here's an interesting thing. A lot of times when we think about we need to change our energy sources, we imagine that we're just going to stop our fossil fuel use and switch over to solar and wind and other sources like that. But most experts and even the cleanest scenario by countries and globally, even the cleanest one where we've switched as much as we can, as quickly as we can, include continued use of fossil fuels. So what this means is that we shouldn't be upset. We shouldn't say like, oh, this is so wrong. But what we have to do is accept that there's going to still be fossil fuels in the mix. And there will have to be in order to not cause strife to developing nations in other areas. So you might ask the question, how is it that we could still use fossil fuels and go through something like decarbonization? How can we, still use our fossil fuels but not detrimentally contribute to climate change? And the big key there is the carbon capture and sequestration that some people presented in their renewable presentations a couple weeks ago. And what that means is, when we combust fossil fuels, a lot of stuff is released, like carbon dioxide. It just comes out, and most that we combust, most of that energy is lost, right? We can only capture about a third of it. But what we can do with carbon capture is we don't let that CO2 just go into the atmosphere. There's a way we capture it and incorporate it in a building, or incorporate it in the ground, or incorporate it somewhere else. So carbon capture, we don't let it go into the atmosphere. Sequestration means we bury it somewhere, maybe in concrete, something like that. So the idea is we're still going to need a little bit of a lifetime. Maybe not you and I personally, but there are areas that will need it. So can we introduce new technologies that don't lead to such problematic problems when it comes to releasing a lot of the things that cause us, exacerbate climate change and cause us some breathing difficulties and that kind of thing? Okay, but here's the interesting thing. So we're about in the second part of the tertiary energy transformation, where it says from hydrocarbon to new energy sources. And what you see is that oil change will steady out for a while. It'll stay around the same amount. Natural gas will likely increase, and that's an okay thing. Natural gas is the cleanest burning fossil fuel. But then what you'll see is a big jump in renewables. So that's a big win. Okay, well, what you know from the previous slide is that China and India are going to demand more electricity over time, right? So that's an important thing to file away. This is a recent history graph. It's not the current graph. Actually, it's shifted very quickly over time, and it's a funky way to look at a map. So we're kind of looking down, and you see the US, Canada, and South America sort of in the upper, I don't know how this is for you, this way, upper left side, and then you see Africa down here, and then you see China over here, and then Australia over there. And so if you look at the United States, which is up here, what you see, these are oil. This is the oil trade, by the way. What you see is that the United States is importing a lot of oil. It's importing some from Canada, probably from the tar sands. It's importing some from South America, and it's importing a lot from Saudi Arabia. And then if you look over at China, that's an important one that we'll focus on. What you see is that China is also importing a lot of oil. So it's not really exporting very much. And a lot of the oil comes from Russia. Okay, a lot of the oil comes from areas in Africa and in Saudi Arabia. And then if you look at Russia, which is kind of in the middle, and that's another big player when we talk about geopolitics of energy. Notice how much Russia is selling to Europe and selling to China. What you know from the reading is Russia has used its energy source, its energy supply, as a political tool, as a power tool. And with Ukraine and with another state, a nation called Georgia, a nation state, it's actually turned off its natural gas over time. And so what does the country do that needs that natural gas so it won't freeze in the winters? It says, okay, I'll comply, Russia, whatever you want me to do. So interestingly, when we have neighbors, and you can consider this as a world family, there are neighbors who are manipulative, there are neighbors who are good, and there are neighbors who strive for power and use that power in ways we don't like. And so we have to live together and realize that, okay, Russia is going to be a big supplier of some of this energy, and what will we do when they do things we don't like. Okay, the other thing that I want you to notice in this graphic is we're going to ignore Africa for a moment, and it's not because Africa doesn't have a lot of resource, it's just because it's probably not going to become a sort of leading power in that area anytime soon because of poverty and corruption and some other things. It just hasn't had the same advantages that other countries have had. We're going to look at Saudi Arabia and Russia, and look how much of the oil supply comes from those two. You're probably thinking, Ellen, why are we talking about oil? And that's because it's still going to be a big thing for a while. Okay, so Russia and Saudi Arabia are now two big players when it comes to where people get their oil, and I should say natural gas as well. All right, this is recent history. We're going to look at one more recent history graph, and this shows different countries, and it's looking at consumption and production. So we're going to look at Russia, and what you'll notice is that Russia consumes less than it produces. So Russia's a power player when it comes to being able to, give natural gas and oil to other places. China is a big consumer, but it doesn't have a lot, and that's another important thing. Okay, so those are the two we're going to focus on. Saudi Arabia also is a third one we'll focus on. It is a producer, but it's a producer, but it consumes less, so it has net excess. And then the United States, notice how the circles are really close to each other. So this is recent history. And the United States has the biggest circle because it consumes the most energy for this particular date, which was 2016. Okay, now here's a crazy thing that's happened in the last couple of years, and I don't think I was as aware of this until recently. And so, generally, when we think about where we get our oil, we think about, oh, the Middle East, right? That's where we've actually put a lot of military presence, primarily to protect our oil interests, because we run on oil, a lot of oil. Okay, so here's an interesting thing. In the past couple of years, the United States has become the main producer of oil. So if you look at this, notice that it doesn't say like all the Middle East, it focuses on Saudi Arabia, and because Saudi Arabia is the biggest player in that area. So Saudi Arabia now produces less than Russia, and Russia produces less than the US. And what that means to us is that in terms of oil, we're becoming more energy independent. So we're less dependent on Middle East conflicts. And if we look at that graph for a minute and you look at Saudi Arabia, if you look at, I think it's 2019, almost 2020, you see like this big dip in Saudi Arabia. And interestingly, what happened was Iran sent a drone over to Saudi Arabia, because it's kind of an unstable region, and they bombed one of the oil production lines. Major thing that happened in Saudi Arabia. The US was producing so much oil at that time, it didn't affect our oil prices very much at all, if at all. So interestingly, we're less dependent on conflict in the Middle East. Good things and bad things. I just thought I'd point that out. The North Sea is up here too, because when you think about the North Sea, you're thinking about like Norway, Finland maybe, and maybe some Denmark too. But that's really got some oil that we can drill from the ocean floor. So it's been a big producer for a while, but notice it's kind of declined a little. You might wonder, hey, where are we getting all this oil, right? And so it's come from new discoveries and new technologies. So I didn't realize this, but the shale oil transition that's happened in the United States is actually something that's picked up a lot of speed. And so they're calling this the shale oil revolution, where now the US is kind of the new Middle East. Okay, well, what does that mean geopolitically? Well, we have some power, but it really depends on which countries continue to use oil and decide to buy it from us, because Russia and Saudi Arabia and the North Sea and some other areas are still producing oil. Okay, well, I just thought that would be interesting to bring up. And here is, we're going to switch for a moment, and we're going to look at renewables. So what you notice is that when we look at the share of electricity from renewables, the more magenta the color, the less the share. So if you look at the United States, we're more magenta. So in 2016, we were producing less renewable energy than some other places like China, which was consuming more energy already. So or consuming more electricity from renewables already. So what you see is the quantity, and they have a higher percentage from renewables. All right, that's important, and I'm just going to leave it at that. So we're going to focus on China in terms of renewables for moving forward. And the very last thing that I want to mention in this particular video is that the world is becoming more electrified. So if you think about our energy use over time, it used to be for heat, and it used to be for cooking, right? And that was the main use, because we didn't have technologies. And I'm thinking of way back when. And then over time, we started using energy differently. We had an automobile, and we said, oh my gosh, let's use petroleum and drive around the whole country, right? And that happened worldwide. And then we realized that we could do things like produce mass amounts of electricity through power plants, and we could do that in a nuclear way. Electricity has taken the forefront. So most of our energy use over time will likely start shifting more and more towards electricity. And that's a cool thing to me, because electricity is a very efficient way to transfer energy, whereas heat is a terrible way. So there is some efficiency that comes with that. However, when we think about the future of energy, we're going to not in geopolitics. We're going to think less about what in the world is going on in the Middle East. That won't matter to us as much unless there's a nuclear threat, right? Or something like that. We're going to think more about who controls the grid. And interestingly, there's this concept of a supergrid where China would go in with Russia and some of Europe, and they'd have this huge supergrid, or China would go in with Asia, and there'd be this huge connected grid where they would work together. The only concern that I have about that is the region is not necessarily kind. And so with our what we know about Russia turning things off and maybe China being a little more autocratic, the concern is, are they going to shut off electricity to gain some sort of political power, to make someone else do what they want? So that's a frightening thing to me. But the idea of supergrids is coming up. So that's something to file away. But what this means is that one of the biggest threats then, when we think about our future in energy, will of course always be our source. But if we're independent and rely more on renewables with time, then maybe that's better. But it's also cyber attacks. Like, that is becoming a bigger deal, especially if the grid is controlled electronically and someone gets into the grid from somewhere else and causes some disruption. Our biggest in the US cyber security threat is Russia at the moment, which is fascinating. So I just thought I'd let you know. And that's going to conclude this video. So just Just a quick summary, the consensus from experts and even the cleanest view of our energy transition is that the world will still use fossil fuels in the near future. Coal will dampen down, energy will reach a peak faster, and then natural gas will take a little longer. Decarbonization, so we can meet climate goals and still use fossil fuels if we have ways of capturing and sequestering carbon. Big oil is now coming from the big three, and that would be the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, which means that there's less dependence on places like Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, those things that we often think about. So we need to shift our thinking to think about where oil comes from, to think about the US, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. And then the very last thing, world's going to shift towards increasing electrification, which brings new challenges. So no longer will we think about burning oil fields, we'll start thinking about cybersecurity. All right, so that's the conclusion of this video, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next one.